Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. And feel free to move up, if you will. There's plenty of spots here. Welcome to the Sacramento Reasons to Believe chapter meeting. And I think most of us are familiar with RTB, but should you be a guest and not, Reasons to Believe basically exists to explore the relationship between God's general revelation, what we call the book of nature, and special revelation, the book of scripture, and to learn how scientific discoveries and philosophical exploration provide an ever-increasing confidence in the Creator, so that the goal is to strengthen believers' faith and to allow unbelievers and skeptics an avenue to understand the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we are delighted tonight to have Dr. Stephen Willing with us. Most of you know him, but let me go over a brief bio. Steve is a board-certified diagnostic radiologist and neuroradiologist with an MD from the Medical College of Georgia and an MBA from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He's held faculty positions at the University of Louisville, University of Alabama at Birmingham, and Indiana University, where he taught and practiced diagnostic and interventional neuroradiology. During his 20 years of academic medicine, Steve published over 50 papers in the areas of radiology, informatics, and management, and authored the Atlas of Neuroradiology, which was published by W.B. Sanders in 1995. Since retiring in 2016, Steve serves as a radiology consultant to Tenwick Hospital, a large Christian hospital in Kenya. He's also an op-ed contributor to the Christian Medical and Dental Associations and actively blogs in his site, The Soggy Spaniel, which I commend to you. He has all sorts of interesting things that are pertinent to the church and to modern day issues. And probably more importantly, has a nice comic relief from the spaniel. Additionally, he serves as the Alabama State Director for the American Academy of Medical Ethics, which is an important voice in medical ethics for Judeo-Christian and Hippocratic medical ethics, and is an adjunct professor of divinity at Regent University and a visiting scholar for Reasons to Believe. In addition to that, Steve has authored a book. We thought it was in progress, but apparently it's been published in September of 2022, as I looked up, Superbia, The Perils of Pride and the Power of Humility. So, Steve, thank you for being here, and we look forward to your talk on a call to sexual apologetics. Thank you very much. Oh, and if you wouldn't mind, those of you who are on Zoom, muting your speakers if you've not already done so, and we'll have a chance for questions at the end.
Steve, you are muted.
Okay, are you recording this? I had tried to start record, but it says I don't have permission.
Yes, we're recording.
Okay, great. Okay. Everybody see my screen?
Yes.
All right, thanks for having me over tonight. Tonight I want to talk about something I think is vitally important and often overlooked. It's not that there's been no activity in this area, but when you look at the broad landscape of apologetics, you'll see major organizations like Reasons to Believe or Answers in Genesis or Discovery Institute. Then you think about sexual apologetics and what is there? There seems to be a bit of a void. I'm going to try to tie everything together into one central thesis as we go through tonight. But I'm first going to lay the groundwork. Houston, we have a problem. The church is in a state of crisis, you might say, and everybody has their own explanations. Here's some of the data. You've probably seen this. If not, it's important that you know about this. For several decades, church membership among U.S. adults had fairly steady, around 70%. In the last 2 decades, it's actually been falling rapidly down to below 50% in the latest Gallup survey in 2020. Pew Research says that among Protestants, the share who say they are born again or evangelical is as high or higher than a decade below, but the absolute numbers are declining. So more Protestants are evangelical, but there are fewer Protestants. In essence, we are having a larger share of a smaller pie. Another very sobering statistic from the Public Religion Research Institute, looking at the median age of religious groups. And if at the top here, white evangelical Protestant, which is, looks like most of us here tonight, average age of 56. And I see this every Sunday when I go out to a church that I've been attending since the early 90s. There's an increasing number of gray and balding heads out in the congregation. And when this generation passed, who's going to continue to keep these churches going? Who's going to keep it alive? Something does not seem to be working. I'm getting warnings coming up here on my computer. So what's going on here? Well, pastors often come up with, spiritual sounding answers like, well, maybe we just need to pray more. Is it just a lack of prayer? Well, that sort of is blaming God, isn't it? Because we're all praying for this. And the Bible doesn't tells us to pray, but we all also are commissioned to a long list of other things, of which prayer is just one. Prayer is not the only answer in any case. Is it a lack of preaching? I sure can't see any evidence for that, nor does anyone else. The Word of God has been faithfully proclaimed in churches around this country consistently, and we're not seeing a situation where the churches with good preaching are thriving and the churches with bad preaching are wilting. Across the board, there's a decline. Has the church gotten too political, as many people think, or is it not political enough, as other people think? Here's some of the resources. The Great Dechurching by Jim Davis and Michael Graham came out last year. You Lost Me from Barna Research came out about 12 years ago, and his famous Already Gone by Ken Ham and Britt Beamer. Could it be theological liberalism? Well, for much of my lifetime, that would have been true, that we were seeing the greatest declines in the mainline denominations that were trying to, say, throw out the supernatural, explain away the miracles, teach universalism, other theological trends, but that is less true today. I still think this is a contributor, don't get me wrong, but the evidence, we're not in a position as theological conservatives to sit comfortable and think, well, it's not affecting us as well. No, could it be millions of years? That's what a leader of a major organization claims, but it kind of shows that when your only tool is a hammer, the whole world is a nail. Or could it be pride? Andrew Murray said a lack of humility is the source of every defect and failure. And I think there's a good case to be made for that last one, but that's not where we're going to go tonight. Well, one way of approaching this is to ask the people who are leaving the church, ask them in their own words. This is not written down, it's not recorded, it's sort of apocryphal, but it's in a blog that Tim Keller was at a Gospel Coalition meeting about 10 or 12 years ago. In a panel discussion, he shared this story. And he said this is not a practice that he would recommend, but he was speaking to an older man who did a lot of ministry to college students. And this older man told Tim Keller that often students would come home from college, say on summer break, and he said, I took this course in physics and chemistry or philosophy, and I'm starting to have a little questions, and I'm really not so sure that all this Christian thing is really working for me. And the older gentleman looked him straight in the eye and said, "Who are you sleeping with?" And he said, usually they would say, "How do you know? How did you know?" But it would certainly take the conversation in an entirely different direction. Aldous Huxley, the grandson of T.H. Huxley, known as Darwin's bulldog, author of Brave New World, said, "For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom." Or this rather frightening visage, Abraham Piper, son of John Piper. I'm sure you've heard of him. He was a wayward son of John Piper. Now he's sort of an evangelist for atheistic humanism. Abraham Piper said, "At first I pretended that my reasoning was high-minded and philosophical, but really I just wanted to drink gallons of cheap sangria and sleep around." I mean, when people are that honest, we probably want to listen to them. Or there's Bart Campolo, son of Tony Campolo. You see the title for this feature article, "The Evangelical Scion Who Stopped Believing." As a freshman at Haverford College, he had 2 gay roommates. At the time, even liberal evangelicals like his dad treated homosexual behavior as a sin, but Campolo couldn't bring himself to think ill of his roommates. He instead adjusted his theology to make room for them. Or as C.S. Lewis said, "Chastity is the most unpopular of the Christian virtues." That's from Mere Christianity. Now, I don't know that's necessarily true. I think humility is a pretty tough sell, maybe even a harder sell, because as we get older, our sex drives diminish physiologically, but as we get older, our egos do not diminish. But he's entitled to a little bit of hyperbole, being C.S. Lewis. So those are all individuals. Those are anecdotes. What about formal research? And there's actually been a lot of people who are analyzing this, the sociologists in particular, also the polling organizations, and they don't really come to a consistent result. What you see, and this is true for almost everything in life, there are a multitude of reasons. I would certainly leave pride high on that list, something I'd love to talk about in some other forum. But let's start with this. Putnam and Campbell. Robert Putnam wrote the book you may have heard of called Bowling Alone. He's a sociologist. They did the American Faith Survey in the early 2000s and reported in this 600-page book, American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us. Rod Dreher commented, and I read the relevant sections of the book, and this is fair enough. Over time, the data showed attitudes on moral issues proved to be strong predictors of religious engagement. In particular, the more liberal one was on homosexuality, the less likely one was to claim religious affiliation. So there's that. Mark Regnerus, who spoke to the Austin RTB chapter in September. He's a sociologist, Christian sociologist at the University of Texas at Austin, has written 4 books published by Oxford University Press. And we're going to be hearing a lot about him in the next few minutes. He wrote in 2007, "Evangelical Protestant youth may hold less sexually permissive attitudes than most other religious youth, but they are not the last to lose their virginity on average, not even close." George Barna, the Barna Group, in 2011, 40% of the 18 to 29-year-olds with a Christian background completely or mostly agreed that the church's teachings on sexuality and birth control are out of date. Or Jim Davis with the Great Dechurching, they were only looking at people who had left the church. They had been active Christians who were no longer attending and had just left maybe in the last, say, 5 years. 11% of the de-churched evangelicals in our study indicated that the church was too restrictive of their sexual freedom. More than 1 in 10 de-churched evangelicals choose not to attend a church that disagrees with their sexual behavior. And the survey data may underestimate it because I think that's dependent on people's honesty, not only with the person taking the poll, their honesty with themselves. A lot of people maybe won't even acknowledge to themselves that that's the real reason. Rod Dreher, who wrote The Benedict Option and a couple other books, Live Not by Lies, he wrote, when people decide that historically normative Christianity is wrong about sex, they typically don't find a church that endorses their liberal views. They quit going to church altogether. Or Mary Eberstadt, and she's a Catholic. I think she was atheist and converted to Catholicism, but she's a scholar. She has been with the Hudson Institute. She's with some other major think tank right now. George Will described her as intimidatingly intelligent. She wrote in How the West Really Lost God, the most profound earthly fallout of the sexual revolution is its ongoing life or death struggle with Christianity itself. Michael Brandon Doherty reviewed her newest book, Adam and Eve After the Pill Revisited. The author, Michael Brandon Doherty, writes for National Review. In his book review, he said, Eberstadt's arresting thesis is that the decline of family life is a preview of defection from the Christian church, not the reverse. So I'm building a case here. We've seen what individuals say, their own words. We've seen what some of the polling data shows. Well, let's focus in on that. What do Christians really believe about sex? We actually have some really good data on that. Pew Research. The good news, I guess, is Christians are less likely than the religiously affiliated to say casual sex and open relationships are acceptable. But if you look at the Christian group, sex between unmarried adults in a committed relationship is only a third of Christians said it's never acceptable. And then those casual sex between consenting adults who are not in a committed relationship, only a third said that was never acceptable. You're already seeing a half that said that's okay. Well, maybe that's liberal Christians. What about the evangelicals? Well, roughly 1/3 of evangelical Protestants say casual sex between consenting adults is always or sometimes acceptable. There's Christian, evangelical, so we have 47%. These say it's not acceptable, the 47%. The ones who say it's acceptable always or sometimes, here, the blue is 36%. So almost over a third say it's always or sometimes acceptable. So this creates a situation where they may secularize and leave the church because their lifestyle isn't consistent with a Christian lifestyle. But even if they stay, there are still issues. And pastors are increasingly having to deal with this. The cohabitation dilemma comes from American pastors from Christianity Today 3 years ago. And that does put our pastors in a very difficult situation when a cohabiting couple wants to attend. And what do you do? I mean, you kind of want them to be under the ministry, you want to be under the care of the church, but then they're setting a bad example for everybody else. The Presbyterian Church in America, it's my denomination, established a sexuality study group in the General Assembly of 2019. They came back with a report that was approved in 2021. It's a lengthy report, but about a fourth of that study report is making the case for sexual apologetics. And they reported that arguably Christians cannot make a plausible case for the biblical sex ethic because in many ways we have adapted too much or even adopted the contemporary views of identity and freedom in the way we preach and do ministry. So what's going on here? You know, when I first was invited to speak, they wanted to say, should I talk about transgenderism? I can do that. I've done that. And when we think of apologetics, well, we think of, okay, arguing against homosexuality or transgenderism or maybe abortion. But is that really the core of the issue or is it something else? I think it's predominantly something else. Let's just look at the lay of the land. Let's look at what's happening in culture and both inside and outside of the churches. What we're seeing, first of all, is because we're seeing that marriage is in decline. In 1970, 89% of American males were married by 35. By 2020, 40 years later, That was down to 64%. In 1970, 88% of women were married by 29. In 2010, that was down to half. Mean of age of marriage is over 30. This is already out of date. Mean age of marriage is over 30 in much of Europe. It's over 30 almost in the entire West.
He's one of the researchers, reasons to believe. And he's talking about sexuality and how that's impacting.
Mute somebody.
No, it's live.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So it's not this house in the middle, it's over there. I'll show you.
Can the host mute everybody, please?
Left or right?
It's on the right side. It's on the right side.
79.
So we thought it was this house in the middle. It's not.
Hello?
It's not this.
Pardon.
It's right here. It's a white, he's parked right.
Okay, is it muted? Okay, so the Census Bureau, percent of households by type. Married households back in 1940 were almost 80% were married households. We're down below 50% now, whereas non-family households are all on the rise. A percent married among 18 to 34-year-olds in 1978, 59%. In 2018, it's almost cut in half. It's cut in half, 29%. Increasingly, young people are faced with the prospect that they may never get married. The share of never married adults reaches a new high. It's quadrupled from 1970 to 2018. The blue line is never married between 25 and 50. The currently married has diminished now to just around 50%. And this doesn't reflect the full picture because there's a strong economic component to this. The wealthy are somewhat more likely to be married, and the less affluent are substantially less likely to be married or more likely to be never married. And even among parents, you would think, well, parents really want this for their children, but that's not necessarily the case. Pew Research just 1 year ago, parents prioritize financial stability and job satisfaction. The percent of parents saying it is important to them that their children do each of the following as adults. 88%, it was extremely or very important that they be financially independent, have careers or jobs they enjoy. Get married, only 21% of parents thought that was important. Only 20% of parents thought it was important that their children have children. Is it any mystery that the birth rate is declining, that we've been below replacement in the US and most of the developed world for decades now, actually? Okay, so why? So far I've just described, I point to defection from the church and secularization, come up with an explanation. Well, it's this sexual behavior. Okay, but what's driving that? What is going on? Why have the numbers changed so drastically across the last 40 to 50 years? Well, there are several possibilities. Increasing secularization, just people leaving the church, but that seems to have it backwards. It seems like people get secularized and leave the church, not leave the church and become secularized. It could be just philosophical materialism, they'll live for the moment because there is no eternity. Moral relativism has been blamed, and radical individualism, and that's certainly a big thing in our culture, that it's all about me, it's all about my own self-actualization. Theological liberalism, again, shows up as a possible cause, and that's kind of a byproduct of all these things above. But there's one thing that seemed to float to the surface. Mark Regnerus, I mentioned earlier, the sociologist from University of Texas at Austin. In 2017, he wrote this op-ed for the Washington Post, said Christians are part of the same dating pool as everyone else, and that's bad for the church. Regnerus says it's not science that's secularizing Americans, it's sex. In other words, cheap sex. All right, what's cheap sex? That needs some explaining. And for that, I'm going to share a brilliant 10-minute video that comes from his department. It's the the Austin Institute for Family Studies at University of Texas, Austin. And this describes it better than I could do, and it gives you a break from having to listen to me for 10 minutes. Please pay attention.
ever wonder if romantic relationships are getting increasingly more difficult to navigate these days? Why fewer couples are getting married, and later than ever before?
Time for a crash course on the economics of sex. Let's think about sex as an exchange, where each person gives the other person something of themselves. It might appear at face value that they are giving the same thing, intimate access to each other's bodies, but there's more going on here than meets the eye. Men and women both enjoy sex. We all know that. But what's interesting is how the data tells us that men and women experience sex differently. On average, men have a higher sex drive than women.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12.
Blame it on testosterone, call it whatever you want. But on average, men initiate sex more than women. They're more sexually permissive than women, and they connect sex to romance less often than women. Nobody's saying this is the way it ought to be. It's just the way it is.
Women, on the other hand, are likely to have sex for reasons beyond just simple pleasure. Her motivations for sex often include expressing and receiving love, strengthening commitment, affirming desirability, and relationship security.
So in an exchange relationship where men want sex more often than women do, who decides when it will happen?
She does, of course. Sex is her resource. Sex and consensual relationships will happen when women want it to. So how do women decide to begin a sexual relationship? Pricing. Women have something of value that men want.
Badly. Something men are actually willing to sacrifice for.
So how much does sex cost for men?
It might cost them nothing but a few drinks and compliments. Or a month of dates and respectful attention. Or all the way up to a lifetime promise to share all of his affections, wealth, and earnings with her exclusively.
The price varies widely. But if women are the gatekeepers, why don't very many women charge more, so to speak?
Because pricing is not entirely up to women. The market value of sex is part of a social system of exchange, an economy, if you will, wherein men and women learn from each other
And from others.
what they ought to expect from each other sexually.
So sex is not entirely a private matter between two consenting adults. Think of it as basic.
Supply and demand. When supplies are high, prices drop. Since people won't pay more for something that's easy to find.
But if it's hard to find, people will pay a premium. And the same rings true with sex.
Men know that sex is cheap these days, if they know where to look.
So how did we get here? How did the market value of sex decline so drastically? Economists often speak of technological shocks that dramatically alter markets.
Take pesticides, for example. Pesticides revolutionized agriculture, enabling its mass production on a level unparalleled in the history of human civilization.
Lawns became greener, produce became better, and widely available with a marvelous variety.
We eat like kings now, and the market has changed forever.
Here's another example. Artificial hormonal contraception, or the pill, allowed men and women to have sex while avoiding pregnancy. This was a technological shock that forever altered the mating market by profoundly lowering the cost of sex. It didn't change overnight, but the effects have been, one might say, revolutionary.
Before contraception, sex before marriage took place during the search for a mate, someone to marry. Sex didn't necessarily mean marriage, but serious commitment was commonly a requirement for sex. Sex was oriented towards marriage.
Don't believe people who say your great-grandparents were secretly as casual about sex as your friends are. They weren't, because to mess around with sex eventually meant, well, becoming parents.
Remember the example of pesticides? It turns out that they had unforeseen effects that are wreaking havoc on the environment and weakening the natural ecological systems that we depend on.
Scientists believe that because of pesticides, the bee population is dropping at an alarming rate. 1/3 of all the food we eat depends on those bees for pollination. And that's just one example.
It is now feared that the overuse of pesticides is throwing ecology as we know it into disarray.
While the original purpose of the pill was to prevent pregnancy, the data reveals an unanticipated side effect. The pill threw the mating market into disarray.
Having sex and thinking about marriage have now become two quite different things.
We now have a split mating market,
One corner where people are largely interested in sex,
and one corner where people are largely pursuing marriage,
and there are more men looking for sex than women.
and more women looking to marry than men. The language of online dating reinforces the reality of this split mating market.
Men are more apt to write that they are looking for fun, while women tend to signal very different things, saying things like,
Only serious inquiries, please.
or,
Not into games. So this split mating market poses a particular problem for women. They certainly call the shots when it comes to short-term sexual relationships because men outnumber them. This enables women to be more selective in the short term. But the reverse is true when they decide they want to settle down. We often hear about men's lack of commitment,
but the blunt reality is an economic one. Women vastly outnumber men in the marriage market, which means men can be picky and can insist on extensive sexual experience before committing. Men are in a position to maximize their rewards while investing fewer resources. Why do men do this?
because they can. Here's the thing, in the past, it really wasn't the patriarchy that policed women's relational interests. It was women. But this agreement, this unspoken pact to set a high market value of sex, has all but vanished. But in a brave new world where having sex no longer means babies and marriage has become optional, the solidarity women once felt towards each other in the mating market has dissolved. Women no longer have each other's backs. On the contrary, they're now each other's competition. And when women compete for men, they tend to do so by appealing to what men want.
Here's where women are wrong about men. Men are not actually afraid of commitment at all.
While women are the gatekeepers when it comes to sex,
The deal is that men are in the driver's seat in the marriage market. They can navigate it exactly how they want to. And unlike women's fertility, men's virility doesn't expire by 40 or 45 or 50 or even 60.
Hello, young lady.
So what's the rush?
talk about having the upper hand.
So it should come as no surprise that the average age of first marriage in the United States continues to rise, and that the share of Americans between the ages of 25 and 34 years old who are married is continuing to drop.
While there are certainly factors that contribute to each of those trends, the gender imbalance in a split mating market is a big one. Talk about a profound irony.
By nearly every measure, young men are failing to adapt to contemporary life. When attractive women will still go to bed with you, life for young men, even those who are floundering, just ain't so bad. In reality, men tend to behave as well or as poorly as the women in their lives permit.
Economists say that collusion, women working together, would be the most rational way to elevate the market value of sex. But there is little evidence of this happening among women today. At least, not yet. If women were squarely in charge of how their relationships transpired and demanded a higher market price for the exchange of sex, so to speak, we'd be seeing, on average, more impressive wooing efforts,
Greater male investment,
longer relationships,
fewer premarital partners,
shorter cohabitations.
and more marrying going on.
For a woman to know what she wants in a relationship and to signal it clearly, especially if it's different than what most men want, this is her power in the economy. But none of these things seem to be occurring. Not now, at least.
Today, the economics of contemporary sexual relationships clearly favor men and what they want, even while what they are offering in the exchange has diminished. And it's all thanks to
Supply
demand
and the long reach of a remarkable little pill. Brought to you by the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture.
So I'm back. It's a brilliant little video that explains a lot. There's a little bit more to this that I would add. They talk about how marriage, sex has become cheap, but marriage has not become just expensive, it's become a trophy. What they talk about is the foundational view of marriage, which would have been the traditional view that held for millennia, actually, where you got married upon attaining adulthood and then set out to build a life together. That might include starting out on a career, completing your education. Whereas that was the foundational view, but now society has framed it that people seem to naturally assume that you should postpone marriage until you finish all of your training, until you are financially independent, maybe you've got a home, till you feel mature and ready. So marriage has become a trophy. It's called the capstone view. The capstone is that little rock on the top of a pyramid. Rather than the foundational view, marriage is now the capstone of a lifetime of achievement. Of course, what that does is that makes marriage more expensive and then puts it out of reach of many people. Also, perversely, it sort of raises the expectations of women. So it's not just men who are reluctant to commit or choosy and picking a life partner. Women also become very particular because women, on average, and of course, we're always talking about averages here, there are exceptions in every case, but women on average do not like to marry down. They want to marry up in terms of education or social class. So marriage is very threatened by this. So from foundation to capstone, this idea that you have to be established in your career, have financial security, and then sometimes there's expectations of throwing these extravagantly expensive weddings all raise the cost of marriage and make it an achievement rather than the beginning of an adult life. Well, that describes the situation. What are the consequences? Where is this leading this? Again, primarily, I'm approaching this from an apologetic standpoint, and especially for advocating for strengthening the church and discipling our young people so they don't fall prey to all these misconceptions. Speaking of misconceptions, I mean, there's nothing intuitively immoral. This capstone view of marriage, there's nothing obviously, neon lights, this is wrong, which is why I think even throughout the church, young people tend to accept this quite passively. It's not a wrong idea. It's just probably unhealthy in the long run because, in terms of maintaining virginity for a period of years, there's going to be decay every year. Every year, more and more people are going to succumb. But if people are marrying at 22, then it's going to be a lot more people making it to 22 than there are going to be people making it to 32 or 42. So even from that alone, it should be pretty obvious that postponing marriage is probably unhealthy for you physically and spiritually. What are some of the consequences? Well, loneliness epidemic, because the happiest people, studies repeatedly show, are married people. And one of the best cures to loneliness is having a spouse. That's true for men and women. Overall, female happiness has declined over the last 40 years. There's this article called The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness, where overall life satisfaction since the sexual revolution has declined throughout the West among females, both in absolute terms and relative to males. Perhaps germane to our discussion tonight, it has been linked to religious disengagement. This leads to a failure of discipleship if we're losing the young people. They did describe male underachievement, and I'll talk about again just briefly, and sexual predators are the sexual revolution has created the perfect breeding ground for the formation of sexual predators. They showed that picture of the guy sitting on the couch, and they said some men, of course, this isn't all, but there is a minority, there's a small number of men who, if they can have easy sex, that's all they need in life. Why bother to go out and hold a steady job? Why bother to control my appetites? Why bother to stay sober? Why bother to do anything? Roy Baumeister, who's a really well-respected and widely published social psychologist, wrote in 2012, giving young men easy access to abundant sexual satisfaction deprives society of one of its ways to motivate them to contribute valuable achievements to the culture. And here I'm kind of transitioning into what an apologetic would look like, but here I'm showing now how you would make the apologetic argument for biblical sexuality. I'm not doing that tonight. That I work out over a series of 8 lessons that I have in my curriculum that I've given at church. but more proven impact of this sexual revolution, and especially this thing about cheap sex and the increasing cost of marriage. The likelihood of marriage is strongly correlated with economic status. This leads to both economic and political polarization. There's a strong connection between sexual liberalism and political liberalism. It drives a wedge in society because they talk about the success pathway, that if you graduate from high school, get a job, get married, and have children, in that order, the chances of staying out of poverty are 98%. It's called the success sequence. Well, not everybody follows that pathway, but through marriage, it turns out the rich are more likely to follow that pathway and their children are more likely to follow that pathway. So through marriage, the rich and educated succeed, but without it, the poor stay poor. Lack of marriage leads to social disruption because young people raised without a father, especially young boys, are at risk for almost every measurable negative social and psychological outcome. But very close to home, the health of the church, I think, is highly interwoven with the health of marriages. There are just too many people. This isn't Steve Willing standing up here on a rock pounding the table or something. I mean, there are some really well-educated people who have studied this for decades who say that the health of the church is highly interwoven with the health of marriages. Well, apologetics. What is apologetics for? I mean, too many times we think, well, we have this concept, well, apologetics is where we browbeat atheists with our arguments for the existence of God, pummeling them into submission. And that's really not it. I mean, Hugh Ross does a great job of showing how to be civil in your apologetics. But R.C. Sproul wrote this in the Table Talk magazine just a couple of years before he died. The task of apologetics, he has three aims. The first is to provide an answer to the critics of the Christian faith. The second is to tear down the intellectual idols of our culture. And I think we're active in that. The intellectual idols today are usually the number one idol in any culture in any time in history is the person in the mirror. But what I highlighted here, the third and what I believe is the most valuable aim of apologetics is to encourage the saints to shore up the church. So, it's good that we have apologetics reaching out to the unconverted, to the skeptics, to the lost, but apologetics is for the church itself. That's what we need to be teaching our youth, teaching our congregation, because I agree with him. I mean, again, this is his opinion. I mean, because this isn't Holy Scripture, but I think it's a very sound, and it's certainly been borne out in my observation experience and many, many others, that the church is suffering because of a lack of apologetics, and where the church is particularly suffering is in the area of sexuality. So what is sexual apologetics? Well, I would approach this with one central thesis. You don't need the Bible to defend biblical sexuality. This is my thesis. The sum of all evidence spanning several decades of research shows that the optimal paradigm for human flourishing is lifelong heterosexual monogamy. Any departure from that standard in any direction leads to personal and social harm. And this is the vast sum of evidence. This isn't, say, young earthers cherry picking quotes and taking quotes out of context and looking at the 0.001% exceptions to try and disprove the preponderance of evidence. This is where the mainstream science lies in every case. Now, do people know that? No. Some people do. Many are. But there are, even among secularists, there are voices speaking out, but they're a minority. The PCA study committee I referenced earlier said, Christians cannot speak to the world about sex in a compelling way if we merely answer the story with a list of moral imperatives, however biblical. I respectfully submit that, pummeling with Bible verses probably isn't going to have the impact that one might hope. So why bother? Why would we engage? Well, if we're not doing it to convert people, why would we engage in sexual apologetics? Well, number one, for the health of the church. I hope I've convinced you that it's at least an important factor. It may or may not be the biggest factor, but it's certainly an important factor in young people leaving the church and young adults leaving the church, and the resistance to the gospel among those who might otherwise come, but for the sexual issues in their lives. It's important for the health of the society, even if not a single person is converted. Teaching biblical sexuality leads to improved health at every level, improved physical health, psychological health, social health, less crime, less disease. And we are commanded to engage in apologetics. And okay, Dr. Willing, where you get with that one? Well, the weapons of the Spirit, Ephesians chapter 6, they say use the belt of truth. Well, what's truth? Don't say it's the Bible, because that's the sword of the Spirit. That'd be counting it twice. My take on this is that truth is truth. So using the facts, using evidence in defense of scripture and scriptural teaching is engaging in spiritual warfare, because we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So apologetics is spiritual warfare. So where you go next, on my website, swilling.com, I have the curriculum there. It's all free, of course, and no advertising. You click on the header, top right says Defending Biblical Sexuality. At Christian Medical and Dental Associations at cmda.org, they have a blog called The Point, and I contribute there regularly. Dr. Andre Van Mol, who's done way more than me in this and has been doing this for decades, he contributes quite frequently. I would strongly encourage you to get subscribed to the daily breakpoint commentary that comes from John Stodestreet. I've been getting this since long before Chuck Colson died. He used to be the primary writer. But many of these things that I've incorporated in my curriculum, I first hear about them from John Stodestreet. It shows up in a breakpoint column, and I click their links, and I click those links, and I start reading the papers. But it's an invaluable resource. And I just got an email today that the Colson Center, you mentioned in the discussion when we started that some of you are Colson Fellows. The Colson Center just launched a new video curriculum. It's pay-per-view. It's per subscription thing, but I looked at the titles and the content, and they have a lot of material in there that is primarily about sexual apologetics. Dr. Regnerus, I've mentioned repeatedly. I see he's contributed several videos to there, and a number of other people that I'm quite familiar with. So I strongly recommend that. And that is it. I thank you for listening. How are we doing for time? We didn't do too bad. Okay. Any comments, reactions, questions?
I have a question, Steve.
Sure.
I have pastored a church for several years, and when the same-sex marriage piece became part of American culture and was legally passed, it seemed to just put a spiral into the cohabitation piece. That it was like the gays were getting married and the ones who were straight were not getting married. Have you had any kind of research on that?
On what specifically? That, no, I mean, heterosexual marriage still vastly outnumbers homosexual marriage, and homosexual marriage is predominantly women, not men. It turns out you could watch that video and predict what would happen in male-male relationships. There's no gatekeeper, and there's a high sex drive on both sides. Homosexual relationships are well known to be characterized by high levels of promiscuity, and the likelihood of staying faithfully monogamous relationship with one person is pretty remote. That happens. I have heard people who say that has happened, and I don't doubt their word, but I know that the aggregate data shows that that's probably an extraordinarily rare occurrence. But I don't, people like Regnerus could probably comment better on whether legalization of so-called gay marriage has any impact on marriage, but it must be awfully small just compared to the driving force here, which is a pill and cheap sex, and the fact that, for many men, they just don't have to. Anything else? Anybody else?
Yeah, Steve, I got a question. You don't bring up abortion. The pill, a lot of people are not using the pill. And I think it's perhaps another technology that has made cheap sex easy or easier. I believe that exit polls and various kinds of analyses of the 2022 election, where the Democrats just sort of hammered on Dobbs, the Supreme Court Dobbs decision. The Republicans are going to take away abortion. They're going to take it away. And my understanding is it was a very large demographic of 20-somethings and 30-somethings that voted Democratic because they wanted to keep abortion. They want it available. Have you looked at that at all?
Oh yeah, it comes up in my series. Let me just say about abortion, that has been sort of the ruling issue of my adult lifetime, because I, basically turned 18 just shortly, a couple of years after Roe, or a year after Roe. So it's been the dominant issue, and I think it's an important issue. It certainly is. But there are a few paradoxes. I think it's interesting, so I'll spend a couple of minutes here. The idea originally was that, abortion would only be for those dire situations where the woman was destitute, is going to be thrown away or rejected by her parents or something. It turned out that though, because of abortion is really just a backstop, and it sounds 85% of abortions are unmarried women. And most of them are doing it for convenience or inconvenience. And what happened with the pill is that because sex became cheap, the amount of sex between unmarried people skyrocketed. Now the pill is effective, but it's not 100% effective. So that with cheap sex, readily available sex, actually the number, even with contraception, the number of abortions actually goes up, because so many people the denominator is so much greater, maybe the numerator is so much greater of people having sex, that even the fraction of that where it fails is bigger than it was before. But ultimately, most abortion is downstream of this idea that you should not unmarried consenting adults should be able to have sex whenever and wherever they want with anybody who will, and should not be held accountable for the consequences. And pregnancy is one of the consequences. Pregnancy is a consequence that makes that area inconvenient. I think hammering away at abortion, it's killing a child. I would not withdraw from hammering away at abortion. But if you think that's really the root issue, it's not the root issue. The root issue behind the abortion advocacy is this sacred belief that you should be able to have sex whenever, wherever, and with whomever will.
Yes, I agree with you. I guess that's what I'm talking about. There's been a shift in the attitude of society in that direction. And the 20-somethings and 30-somethings want to have sex more often and want that backstop.
Question. Not sure if you can hear me or not.
I can.
Okay, good. Just making sure with the technology. Okay, so my question is, you said that the number of women who are satisfied or happy with their life has gone down over the past few decades. Is that true, right? Is that?
Yes.
Right. I was wondering, is the same true for men, or don't we have data on that?
It's not as dramatic a thing, because no, it's not. Probably because
that gatekeeper thing
for them.
Yeah, that's right. I was just curious as to maybe it even went up or something. I don't know. I just was wondering.
I think now it's probably down. There's so many converging factors now. And of course, the mental health thing, there are a whole lot of other factors going on. I'm a huge fan of Jonathan Haidt. He wrote The Righteous Mind. Right now they're doing the After Babel blog. He collaborates with Jing Twenge down at UC San Diego, who's another eminent social scientist, and he's been following the connection between social media and declining levels of mental health. He co-wrote with Greg Lukianoff, The Coddling of the American Mind, where they talked about this rise of safetyism and children spending all their early years in very sheltered, super sheltered, protected environments, so they grow up anxious and fearful. There's so many other factors going on into the mental health of young people. For one thing, maybe one thing that's been underappreciated is, young women are raised on a diet of, whereas earlier generations, they were raised on Little Mermaid or Snow White. Now they're raised on Moana or Frozen. Well, in the early Disney movies, she finds her true love and they get married. And now the Disney movies, they find themselves, they get empowered. Now, that's kind of a consequence of the second wave feminism, that there's no difference between men and women can be happy if they get power and they get wealth and they get education and all this superficial fluff that the Bible tells us isn't going to satisfy. Well, that still ain't going to change the reality that God designed women so that getting married and having children is pretty foundational to their happiness. You can hammer into them that no, you can't believe that, and they'll grow up believing it, but the id, that deep down inside, that's not going to go away. And I mean, face it, for a 22-year-old woman today, the prospects are pretty bleak, especially if she's a liberal. I wrote a column on this on my website a couple months ago, the declining happiness and the plight of the young liberal female, because increasingly they're even getting polarized, politically polarized. The young women are going further and further left, and the young men are going further and further right, and they're more likely to consider the other as stupid and evil than to consider the other as a potential life partner, much less, maybe moving towards political center. So there's a lot of
could you repeat that again? You said that the women are moving further and further left and men are moving further and further right?
Young men. Yeah.
Why is that? Do we know why that is?
Probably and it may not be true everywhere, but some of these people that I don't follow, somebody throw out some names of these bloggers. I can't remember all these names, but there are some pretty
well, Joe Rogan is the most popular.
That's
Is that
right.
who you're talking about?
That's one of them.
Yeah.
There's one guy that I think is running big legal trails. His name was Andrew something.
Tate? Somebody said Tate? Andrew Tate?
Yeah, Andrew Tate. That's the one I was trying to think of.
Is
Well,
it?
another
Okay.
thing,
I don't know.
another thing that hasn't changed is that if men go out and have many partners, the woman just usually silently absorbs that. Whereas if the woman goes out and has many partners, the man gets extremely jealous. We've had murder-suicides here like crazy, because the reaction of men having their woman, be shared is, not okay. I don't think that's changed. Has it, Stephen?
No, I mean, it's a huge thing. That's why I think this is so crucially important. I have an entire talk on victims of the sexual revolution, and so much social chaos. I mean, it's not just people die from AIDS, they die from STDs, they die from cervical cancer, they die from violence and murder, and it's all because of sex. I mean, we can't be talking. How many people have died because they got into an argument over young Earth versus old Earth? I mean, zero. Okay, I don't think of it. I mean, but some I might be a little cautious around. But
Well, I would add in that we even have a term, Steve, that the young people use called the term incel. You know that one?
Yeah.
Which is short for involuntarily celibate. And that's like a bad thing.
It's kind of, that's because they're inculcated in this idea that sex is something that everybody's entitled to. It's just a normal human function. It's not a privilege to be enjoyed through marriage. So if everybody else is having it, then why shouldn't they?
Dave, could you comment on the role of pornography in this declining marriage rates and sexual unhealthiness?
Pornography has several negative consequences. And again, I do cover this in the course as well. For one thing, we talk about sexual predators, and they have this confluence model of sexual predators. They've identified 3 factors that go into the formation. One is just general misogyny, just contempt towards women, because almost all sexual predators are men. The second one is impersonal sexual orientation. It doesn't mean who you like to do it with. It's having a casual attitude towards sex. Another term for that is sociosexuality. Louise Perry, in the case against the sexual revolution, talks about this quite at length, the sociosexuality and the difference between men and women. Well, high levels of sociosexuality increase likelihood of becoming a sexual predator. But the third one is pornography, and that has now been established as a third leg in the formation of sexual predators. And increasingly that's the case. Now, this debate's been going on my entire lifetime. In the late 20th century, the data wasn't that compelling, but then the pornography was a lot more tame. There's really no comparison between the Playboy of 1970 and the hardcore porn now that any 10-year-old can get on a smartphone. And pornography is definitely being identified as contributing towards sexual violence. It also has other adverse effects. Men get so dosed on it that they become basically impotent, that real human females can't compete with the level of arousal they get through the pornography. And then there's the whole trafficking in women and the abuse of women. It's a highly exploitative process that also has been reviewed. I think New York Times, had this article a couple of years ago where they showed how Pornhub was exploiting all these women, and for MasterCard and Visa threatened to cut off their relationship with Pornhub, and so they removed millions of videos. But it's highly exploitative towards women, and that's just what I could squeeze in 2 minutes. There's a website called yourbrainonporn.com that just shows that it simply goes into the negative psychological effects of it.
Steve?
Yes.
Yeah, if I could just make a comment on that. I've done a lot of research over the years, but it all boils down to the neurons. And what we know from the science is that if we program our neurons, then it's going to run our life. And years ago, 30 years ago, I was having dinner with a man who was about 20 years older than me, and he had had a few drinks. And he made this statement. He said, I don't think when a man's had sex with a lot of women that he can be satisfied with just one woman. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that if we start getting sexually stimulated very young, our neurons no longer become satisfied with the mundane. And that's just the way our brains are wired.
Sexual intercourse results in a dopamine hit, and anything that releases dopamine, your brain wants to keep doing more of. That's true for any number of things, including sex. Now, if you're married, that's a good thing, but if you're not married, that's not desirable. If you're doing it on porn, that's just sick. But sorry.
Hi, I have some.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I said I have a lot of this material on my website. I'll share for a minute on the screen. I just threw this. I had this available as an ebook, but I just did the paperback yesterday and made it available. It's called The Top 10 Myths of the Sexual Revolution. What does science really say about sex? And this is a crash course in sexual apologetics. It's really about 40 pages. It's a little book that I priced as cheap as I possibly could. And here I look at the top 10 myths, like pornography is harmless, or there's nothing wrong with casual sex between consenting adults, or that's just the way God made me, or the sexual revolution was a boon for women. I look at the 10 myths of the sexual revolution in a very kind of brief overview. Again, you don't have to pay for it. It's all free. It's also on CMDA, but it makes a more convenient way, I guess, if you want to distribute it around to other people. Because I have not come across a single book to really get up on this subject. One would have to read about, 3 dozen books on a wide variety of subjects, and that kind of distills everything in a very brief little handbook.
I have some interesting observations about people cohabiting. I've done wedding photography for 30 years in mostly Sacramento and Placer counties. Sacramento is a liberal urban county, Placer is more conservative county. And originally I saw about half the people getting married that in Sacramento County were cohabiting first. And in Placer County, maybe 10% were cohabiting. And toward the end of my career, up in Placer County, at least half were cohabiting. And based on the conversations I had over the years, I wasn't trying to research it or anything. I came to the conclusion the primary driver of people cohabiting was economic. It just got too expensive to rent or own a house with the kind of jobs that we were getting. And it's one particular couple I remember, and they were Christians. They were committed Christians. They're cohabiting. Why? Or were they rebellious? No, it was totally economics. The wife to be had a couple of kids from a previous marriage, and then her husband to be, they're blue collar people, and they were supporting each other and the family there in the home. And they got married when they could, and when they were convinced it was going to be a good match. I mean, they both went through previous unhappy marriages. They wanted to make sure something was going to work. So I didn't see it as rebellion. I saw it as economic necessity, or as they saw it that way.
There's very good data that couples where the wife cohabited prior to marriage have a much diminished likelihood of survival after 10, 20, 30 years. Even if the only person she cohabited with is her future husband, the marriage is still less likely to survive. And if she cohabited with anybody else, it's far less likely to survive long term. That's in my top 10 myths book and articles. One of the myths is called "Marriage is just a piece of paper." If they're just cohabiting for economic reasons, well, those economic goals would be far better served by marriage than cohabitation.
Yeah. I did see a lot of the cohabiting people moving in the direction of marriage, like they would like to be married, and they eventually got married. So, I mean, that was good. It's sad that the situation in our society with jobs and salaries and career problems and all the other stuff makes people feel they need to cut corners and cohabit.
The ultimate reality is we're incredibly wealthy as a nation, and even the poor people in the United States are way better off than poor people in other parts of the world. But even in history, even our own history, when poverty rates were much, much worse, people still got married. So I don't want to be judgmental. I don't want to, blow people off with that kind of rationalization. If we could cut out the emotions and the sympathy and the feelings and just look at the hard data, that argument doesn't wash.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, would you agree that one of the reasons people cohabitate is in our culture, there's this belief, well, we got to find out if we're sexually compatible before we get married. And they use sex and their pleasure in sex as a gauge to their compatibility for a long-term relationship. Would you find that to be a part?
I'm sure they use it as a reason. It's a very poor reason. In fact, it would probably be the opposite. it would lead to a less stable long-term relationship because you're raising the expectations of that potential partner. If they don't meet my expectations, they're not suitable. Whereas marriage is about taking somebody as they are, accepting them as they are.
I agree with you, but I've had some people tell me that, well, I want to make sure that I'm going to want to stay married to them. So they have sex, and then they find out if they quit enjoying it, then they leave them and go look for somebody else.
Yeah, well,
That's what some people have expressed, I'll say.
people are influenced by a lot of false beliefs. I mean, if we want to be harsh, we can call them lies. But people believe that. I'm sure they sincerely believe that. It's just not true. It is.
How can we in the church do a better job of both promoting the gospel and marriage, which there seems to be a correlation, at least with fidelity there. You mentioned that, moral imperatives just by themselves are not very effective, but what can we be doing specifically that would maybe change the trajectory of this?
I can give that justice right here in this Q&A. Mark Regnerus, his last book came out about 2 years ago called The Future of Christian Marriage. And in his closing chapters, he has a fairly long list of recommendations for the church. And it could include things like telling positive stories of successful marriages or marriages that survived hardships and came out stronger, of setting role models, of encouraging, challenging these beliefs, challenging this capstone view that you should postpone marriage until you've accomplished all these great and mighty things. Those are some of the ideas. I think we've got to strongly push back against this deeply held notion that sex outside of marriage is innocent and harmless, because that's kind of at the root of almost all of it.
Can we tie it into the gospel in some way? I mean, tie it into God's unconditional love. How do we theologically frame it, do you think?
The way I do it is, and through my approach, is through natural law. Because what I said, my thesis that I said lifelong heterosexual monogamy is, and what did I say, the optimal paradigm for human flourishing. I mean, that is a virtue that basically that's what everybody says they want. Even wherever you are in the political or ideological spectrum, everybody claims they want the best for people and for society. But the data only points in one direction if we look at that. And that's, I'm not the kind of person who really thinks we need to spiritualize everything into a gospel framework. I get lost in the theology. I'm much more practical, simple-minded, I guess. But I mean, let me say this: the way our opponents, our ideological opponents, take it is they say we're the bad guys. We want what we're approaching is harsh and repressive and punitive and cruel. And we got to turn that around, because all the evidence is the other way. It's not. Our way leads to better physical health, better mental health, better relationships, better social functioning, no matter where you slice it. Things work out better when people marry their life partner and stay married. And so I think there's an overwhelming natural argument to be made that you don't need scripture. I think we can then in turn say, well, this amazing evidence shows that the Bible is actually right on all these things. Well, maybe it's right on some of these other things too, the theological ones that we can't validate empirically.
I got a question. When I first saw the title of your talk, it used the term sexual apologetics. I had no idea what that meant. And I tried to get someone else interested in the talk, and they thought, oh, so is this guy like pro LGBTQ? What's he, you know? And it's like, no, wait, you know. And so I wondered if you could give kind of a summary or this maybe a definition of what you actually mean by sexual apologetics. I mean, you kind of get the idea from the talk, but if could you put it in a nutshell what the term means?
Scientific defense of biblical sexuality. Biblical sexuality being lifelong heterosexual monogamy.
When you say scientific defense, are you saying scientific defense as it's the best, it's kind of like your natural law thing that you were saying before? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So tonight, I wasn't teaching sexual apologetics tonight. It's come up in the Q&A and there are a few allusions to it. I mean,
Yeah.
the talk tonight is not the evidence for it. The talk
Right.
tonight is explaining the urgency of approaching it. But I do have a lot of material online or in that little handbook that addresses that. And there, I'm not the only one. There's lots of other people. I may have gone a little further than other people in getting it organized. Everything I have is free. That Breakpoint Colson Center material that just came out is looking very promising, but it is by subscription. And it's video. I'm not a video person. I prefer to read, but I'm obviously in the minority, it seems like.
Yeah, most people are video people, which I'm kind of with you. I'd rather read it. But another question that I just wondered if you could review in that video, there was this concept of previously women could I want to say they like could form a group to kind of stick up for each other or something. I forget what the words were they used, but could you kind of review that a little bit? Because I had never thought of that before.
I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because what it is a classic case of the prisoner's dilemma. And Regnar's even alluded to that at one point in one of his books. You know what the prisoner's dilemma is? It's one of these classic problems in game theory. And so a crime has been committed and they have circumstantial evidence, but they don't have evidence that's sufficient. Two suspects are apprehended who were working together. We know they were working together. The police suspect that they're working together. They know they were working together. So they pull them in separate rooms. And so they go to the first guy and say, you know, if you help us, if you testify, we will give you a reduced sentence. But if you hold out, if you not say nothing, we will throw the book at you. We'll give you the harshest sentence possible. And then they go to the other guy and tell him the same thing. Now, the best strategy, if they both remain silent, they don't have evidence to convict. But if you choose to stay silent and the other guy rats on you, you get the worst possible sentence. So what do? Do you stay silent, hoping that the other guy also trusting the other criminal? Well, why would you trust a criminal? Okay. So do you trust the other person? Do you stay silent, trust the other person and the chance you'll get off? Or do you squeal and go for at least a reduced sentence? Well, that's called the prisoner's dilemma. And that's kind of what women would be facing in the market for sex. Because if one hold out, it would work great if they all work together. But as long as there are women who are going to make themselves available, then the ones who are holding out are like prisoner who tried to remain silent. They're going to be disadvantaged in the marriage market, which is really what they want.
I see. Yeah, so somewhere around the time of the pill or that time period was when everything broke loose, right? Where all of a sudden the paradigm changed.
You know, it's funny how that consistently that comes up. My first thorough grounding in that was reading Mary Eberstadt's book, Adam and Eve After the Pill. But Louise Perry and the Case Against the Sexual Revolution last year talks about this at length. Louise Perry did a podcast on, I'm pretty sure it was on Incredible with Justin Brierley. I think she has a podcast with him. She's very well spoken. She's kind of a secular liberal feminist, but she has been mugged by reality, so to speak. She knows what the data is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it keeps showing up in right now I'm reading another book about feminism. Forget the authors right now. I'm only halfway through it, but it keeps coming up. And, you know, it's a tough situation because there was never any way you were going to keep the pill off the market. That was just never going to happen. It's too easy to manufacture. It's too cheap. It's too readily available. I mean, you could bewail the Griswold decision in the Supreme Court that made it legalized across the country, but if it hadn't happened then, it would have been inevitable, or you would have gotten it anywhere else. It's just too easy to manufacture.
Yeah. Thanks. I just thought that was interesting. I'd never heard that before.
Steve, are you aware there was a recent panel? I know Barry Weiss was on it, and I don't know the other names, but how the sexual revolution has failed women, something along those lines. Are you familiar with that?
I didn't see it.
Okay. If I get more information, I'll email it to you. The other thing I wanted to ask was, I'm on your website and I was looking for your 40-page book and I can't see it, at least not on that page. I went to the defending biblical sexuality page.
I tell you, well, it's the top 10 myths, and I have individual blog posts. I have, parts 1 and 2, parts 3 and 4, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all there in individual columns. If you click on any column, then the sidebar menu on the right comes up, and there are pictures of both my books, Superbia, The Perils of Pride, and The Power of Humility, and the top 10 myths. If you click on any blog post, it should show up on the right.
One other question, Steve.
Sure.
We talked about, and you made a compelling case for the power of lifelong monogamy. But there are a number of people in our church and church in general who are single and perhaps don't want to be married, or for whatever reason are not getting married. Can you speak to them in terms of your thoughts, how that all plays out for them in this milieu of this kind of hypersexualized society?
Oh, I feel very unqualified to address that. I was single till I was 32, and I was very unhappy about it. I would have been happily get married at 22. I think it's a very painful thing to be single and not want to be single. And I really very much feel for both young men and women who are trapped in this situation now. But I don't really feel qualified to offer them words of encouragement. We live in a very fallen world, and we have to kind of survive by the grace that God gives us. We all face hardships. I wonder how many people truly are single by choice. That could be kind of a face-saving way because really they wanted to get married, but they weren't able to connect with somebody. And if they really genuinely chose to it, they are going to be pretty well-adjusted emotionally and not have the same struggle that someone who's maybe single not by choice is going to have to face. But certainly as a body of Christ, we have a duty, I think, to welcome them into our families, to offer hospitality, to befriend them, to not let them live out alone. I would love to see church families inviting singles into their homes for Thanksgiving dinners and various activities. At the same time, I went through a time when I was hearing people really badmouth singles groups, saying it's a meat market and they should be going there just to hear about the Bible. They shouldn't be going there to meet a future mate. I think that's a horrible attitude. They should be going there to meet a mate. Where else do you want them to get a mate? And being a matchmaker is ridiculed, but I think it's a highly noble undertaking. And it's something we need more of, not less of.
Well, thank you, Steve. Any other questions? We may have time for maybe one more. So we have one more coming.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What I tell young people who are engaged, I tell them, if you have sex before marriage with your future spouse, because whatever the reasons are, you've just shown them that you're willing to have sex with somebody you're not married to. If you can abstain when it's the hardest time in the world to abstain, you will form a belief that you can abstain from being unfaithful.
Touche.
Yes. Good.
A couple of comments that you can respond to. I know one thing is young girls now are learning that sex is casual. It's like body sex, you know, it doesn't have to involve a relationship or anything deeper than that. And if they have sex with a man and they start to have affections for that man and want to spend time with him, they're considered to be clingy. And so they suppress that. There's also, with social contract theory, the ideas about marriage as being a covenant have switched over to being a contract, which is like a contract for a car. If you're not satisfied with the product, you can get out of, you can break the contract. Yeah, you can get a refund. And I think there's also an attitude about the body having nothing to do with defining who we are, which would be an underlying principle in homosexuality, in abortion, euthanasia, just all kinds of stuff, that we're just a cluster of cells, and who we are is a mental construction, but our body has nothing to do with defining that. We can change our body, we can do anything we want to with this cluster of cells. So there's a huge social shift in the way we think about all those things.
Yeah, it's kind of Gnosticism, isn't it? Thank you. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you, Steve. We really appreciate your time and expertise, and it's been a very enlightening time for us. And thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Good night.
We will, just to let people know that next month we will be meeting again, and Dr. Leslie Wickman is going to speak to us on basically the fine tuning of the earth. Should be very interesting. The talk will be, is Earth a lucky accident? So come back next month. It'll be again the third Tuesday evening, and we would love to have you all back then.
Thank you.
Good night.